El Peru Huaca is in Petén, Guatemala. The project has been going on since 2003 as the director of excavations. I returned to the site and the building to continue the excavations when we commenced our 2012 season. And we returned to the field to excavate one of the main temple structures on the plaza, structure M13-1. The focus of my excavation was the platform in the front of the large temple structure, not a residence, but a religious performance space. And I was interested in looking at the exterior facade of that platform and defining what that looked like. So that's what we excavated. The Maya would frequently build over existing structures, and sort of going down and finding them as like an onion, peeling off layers. And so when an excavator, an archaeologist, explores Maya architecture, they know they will probably find phases intact inside a building. As you go further down, you find sort of like going back in time and finding earlier and earlier versions of the same kind of building. So we start, of course, at the very final phase and work our way down into earlier and earlier phases. And that's in fact what we found. One earlier phase that we called Sub 1, and then the second earlier phase, the earliest phase, which we called Sub 2. Sub 2 had a staircase that we defined, which is to say we excavated the extent of it, and we excavated then towards where that staircase was heading, which would be the facade or the front door, basically, of a building. And we indeed encountered that fronting facade, and we're looking for the doorway when we found a four-sided vaulted tomb chamber that was built into the staircase. So it was an unexpected encounter. We eventually found human remains and numerous ceramic vessels, many pieces of jade, lots of worked obsidian, shell adornments, a mirror with stucco painting on the back of it. The mirror was made of pyrite, probably a divinatory device for the individual, and all kinds of ceremonial accoutrement. In that part of the world, our preservation is poor, so we don't have preserved textiles or things like that. But we can still determine, based on the associated sediment and the consistency, that there probably was bundling and wrapping of the body in textile. We had impressions in cement that was used to build the dais that she was sitting on. So we know that she was wrapped in bolted cloth and that she was laying on a surface that had been recently constructed, because the cement was still wet when she was laid down, and the cement preserved these impressions of textile. So it was really exciting to be able to piece together those things. We didn't know the identity of the individual at all. There was no doubt that it was a royal individual. We just didn't know who of the various known kings and queens it might be. And we assumed that we would possibly never know. That is because the Maya themselves in antiquity would re-enter tombs frequently. It was part of their ceremonial practice. They buried very important individuals, and they knew where they buried them, and they would often return even centuries later. When that happened, archaeologists later excavating those contexts have difficulty really being able to pinpoint if there are artifacts that date to a later period mixed in with artifacts from an earlier period. Importantly, that tomb was never revisited by anyone in antiquity, so it was pristine, it was sealed. But most importantly, there was an artifact in the tomb, an alabaster paint pot that would fit in the palm of your hand, featuring an effigy of an individual emerging from a carved shell. On the back of that jar were a series of hieroglyphic texts. Now, none of us in the field could read those texts, but later our project epigrapher was able to decipher them, and basically it includes the name and possessive pronoun of the individual to whom the object belonged. And that individual is Lady Cabell, a very important late classic ruler of Huaca, whom we already knew from history, particularly the history on the Stela 34 here at the Cleveland Museum of Art. Lady Cabell, historically we know, is a woman from the royal line at the site of Calakmul in Campeche, Mexico. She married a ruler at the site of El Peru Huaca by the name of Kinich Balam II. He was a local king from the site. There were a number of artifacts that support the identification of her as Cabell. The headdress we see on Stela 34, for example, features a number of embedded cartouches in it. They actually, in the stela, include her name, which is how we know what her name looks like in the glyphs. And so when we excavated the headdress, we found not those same cartouches with her name glyph on them per se, but a number of embedded elements that were featured mosaic elements of finely carved shell, finely carved jade mosaics that are consistent with this portrayal of her. The headdress was stylized in the same way. It's not the same headdress. She probably had many headdresses, but it's stylized in the same way as the one on Stela 34. Stela 34 also features Lady Cabell holding a shield. It looks to be probably a turtle carapace. In Burial 61, she has a vessel. We know it's a serving vessel, but the way it's placed on her and the way her arm was underneath the vessel indicates that it's almost as though it's mimicking her holding a shield. The iconography on that vessel, incidentally, also is emblematic of iconography from the site where she comes from, where she was born, which is another piece of evidence. And on Stela 34, she is seen with what's called a choke shell over her pelvis. It's basically a bivalve shell that is indicative of royalty and femaleness. And in her interment, we found a bivalve spondylus shell over her pelvis, in the same way that she's got this choke shell, which is highly stylized in this image and representational of the iconography of the Maya. Many people associate archaeologists with simply field work, and so much of our work happens in the lab as artifacts are brought back, cleaned off, really looked at for the first time, put back together, is when a lot of this kind of understanding comes forward, comes through. And so Lady Cabell continues to reveal herself to us in the lab. Our project osteologist, Aaron Patterson, who looked closely at the remains, noted a number of features on the skeleton that suggested that she was a robust female, a strong woman, just very much looking like she does on the stela, a robust, hardy figure. It's very difficult to describe the emotions that we felt when excavating because, as I said, we didn't know the identity of the individual as we were doing the work. We simply did our best to do the best job in respect of the individual whose remains we were working with. It's not rare to find royal tombs, but it is rare to have the perfect confluence of evidence that leads one to be able to make that kind of historical identification.